Brain cells are playing the video game Doom, and that's not even the crazy part about this video. And I don't mean that as a sci-fi novel or a metaphor or anything. 200,000 living human brain cells grown on a silicon chip are in a lab in Melbourne, Australia right now learning to play the game Doom. It blows my mind that a petri dish full of brain cells can play the 1993 first-person shooter, the demons, the corridors, the shotgun, the whole thing. Now, to be clear, they're not great at it. They sometimes spin in circles, they wander into walls, they die a lot, but here's the thing. They're getting better, and they're measurably, observably learning in real time, and they play better than random movements. They are learning. And the company behind this project isn't just doing it like a party trick or anything. They're actually building an entire data centers powered by living brain cells. And for some reason, this isn't everyday knowledge. DARPA just launched a formal military program to develop biocomputers. So the CIA's venture capital arm is already invested. There is a group of philosophers out there, and they're calling for a global ban on this kind of research because, and I'm gonna let this one sit with you for a second, there's a real academic debate about whether zapping neurons with random electricity as a punishment for failing at a video game might constitute a primitive form of suffering. And I know that sounds like a Black Mirror episode, but this is all 100% real. It's happening right now. And I think once you understand how it actually works, where it's headed, it's going to change the way that you think about what intelligence even is. I'm Dylan Curious on YouTube. Hit subscribe, and then let's deep dive into a story that really should be considered science fiction, but for better or worse, it isn't.
Since launching the CL1 last year, we've been working hard behind the scenes to make sure our Cortical Labs API is as friendly, effective, and enjoyable for the user as possible.
Okay, so to understand what's going on here, we need to start with this one company. They're called Cortical Labs. They were founded in 2019 in Australia by a guy named Hong Wing Chong. And I know I also thought I might have been getting trolled when I first read that, but no, this is literally him. You can see him on LinkedIn. That is the guy, and Chong is just like one of those people who has a resume that just doesn't make sense. He's a trained medical doctor from the University of Melbourne. He did a research fellowship at Johns Hopkins, and then he also just coincidentally happens to be a full-stack software engineer. And his co-founder is this guy. His name's Andy Kitchen. And he is a computer scientist that ran Melbourne's first deep learning consultancy. Then there's also their chief scientific officer. This is Dr. Brett Kagan. He is a neuroscientist and PhD specializing in stem cell therapeutics. So these guys are not randos. These are people who sit at the intersection of biology and computing, which is exactly where this story lives.
So this is a scanning electron microscope image of the DishBrain. Here we can see live cells growing on top of a background of electrodes. These are about 17 microns across, and you can see the level of integration here.
So their big question from day one was, what fundamentally drives intelligence? And then instead of doing what everybody else is doing, which is to like actually simulate neurons in software, which is basically what most AI does right now, the basic building block of most of these neural networks is a perceptron, which is like a digital neuron. But instead, they asked, what if we just actually used real neurons, actual living brain cells as computing hardware, and then they call it synthetic biology intelligence. And look, I know that sounds wild, but stay with me because the way they pulled this off is genuinely elegant and creepy, and it reminds me of the game Soma, but it's hard to not look at, that's for sure, or think about. So here's how it works. Step one, you take blood cells from a human volunteer, and by the way, in at least one account, it's the CEO that says a lot of these neurons were derived from his own blood. So it's like his DNA in there. And then when you reprogram those blood cells to go backwards into what are called induced pluripotent stem cells, basically you're hitting the reset button on the cell. You're turning it back into a blank slate. Then you coax these little stem cells cells into becoming something called a cortical neuron, which is a brain cell. It's a living, firing, actual human brain cell at that point. So now you got a bunch of brain cells. You go to step 2, which is that you grow these neurons directly on a silicon chip that's studded with those tiny electrodes you were looking at before. Now at this point, these electrodes can do 2 things. They can send electrical signals into the neurons, and they can listen in to the electrical signals that the neurons are producing on their own. So you have between the interface of the chip and the biological layer this 2-way conversation going on. Now right now, the commercial version of this chip is called the CL1, and it has 59 electrodes, and it has an internal life support system. So what you're looking at here is the CL1. This is the commercial version of this like biological chip hybrid. It has 59 electrodes, an internal life support system, pumps, temperature controls, nutrient filtration. Basically, it's a tiny little hospital for brain cells. And some of the cultures of brain cells, of neurons, these stem cells that have been like reprogrammed, have survived over 500 days in this little hospital. So the neurons are alive and they're staying alive. You have to understand, these neurons are not looking at a screen. They can't see anything. What's happening is a translation. You can imagine it like a sandwich. On one side, you might have a normal computer running the game. And on the other side, you have this living neural tissue. And in between them, the reason we call it like a sandwich metaphor is this middle little software layer that translates between the two. Now, the game's visual information, which is like, you know, the places where the enemies are, which direction you're facing, how much health you have left, this all gets converted into patterns of electrical stimulation that the electrodes are delivering to the neurons. So if an enemy shows up on the left side of the screen, for example, the electrodes on the left side of the array fire. So think about it. Distance and threat information is getting encoded through how fast and how intensely those electrode pulses happen. Now, one of the Cortical Lab scientists, a guy named Alan Loeffler, put it perfectly. He said they need to translate the digital world of Doom into the biological language of neurons, which is electricity. And then the neurons responded. They fired their own electrical spikes. Different patterns of firing get decoded back into game commands. So this random pattern, for example, might mean move right, and then another pattern starts backing off, but only when it also has a signal that damage has like been done. You need to get out of there or something. So all these patterns can start building on themselves in different ways, and then it can learn the larger pattern too. And now all of a sudden, it's kind of playing the game. Cortical Labs CTO David Hogan describes it like this. If the neurons fire in one specific pattern, the Doom guy shoots. If they fire in another pattern, he turns. But here's the part that really caught my attention. How are the neurons learning? Like, what kind of negative signal are they getting? Like, what is the input? How's the reinforcement learning? I just couldn't wrap my head around it until I started making this video. Because remember, these cells are just sitting on a chip. There's no brain, there's no dopamine system, there's no reward center. So how are you going to teach a clump of cells to play a video game? All right, and that's where this guy comes into play. You might already recognize his name if you follow this channel. This is Carl Friston. He is a theoretical neuroscientist at the University of College London, and he developed something called, say it with me, the free energy principle, right? And it's gone a long way in explaining a lot of things that seem to be happening in the biological and artificial world when it comes to what intelligence is. So basically what he's saying is that all biological systems, from a single cell all the way up to an entire brain, are just wired to what he calls, quote, minimize surprise. They all want their environment to be predictable. They actively work to make the world around them match their expectations. So Cortical Labs used that insight in one of the most clever ways I have ever imagined. Like, what they did was when the neurons do something right, for example, they aim at an enemy when they're they navigate towards a target in the proper way, they receive a predictable structured electrical stimulation. So the same voltage, the same duration, nice and orderly across all the electrodes. And that's essentially the positive signal. But then when the character, oh, what's that guy's name? The Doom guy? I don't know. He has a name. But anyways, but when the Doom main guy that you're playing as, when he messes up, like say it walks into a wall or like you miss a shot, they hit those neurons in a petri dish in that little mini hospital with random, chaotic, unpredictable stimulation. So it's just noise. It's not any kind of a pattern that it can latch onto. Also, now it just bugs me. I need to know the name of this guy. What's the actual name of the lead character in the 1993 video game Doom? Oh, I guess the lead character doesn't actually have a formal name. The Doom Marine was the primary designation in the original game manuals. Doom Guy? Flynn Fly Taggart? Okay, actually, we'll just go with Stan. Stan Blazkowicz. He was identified as a descendant of the Wolfenstein series. Okay, we'll just go with Stan. Back to the point. So, when Stan does something right, all of those neurons in the chip get a stable, predictable electrical stimulation. When he messes up, they get hit with random, chaotic, unpredictable stimulation, just noise. And it turns out that neurons really hate random noise, right? Carl Friston's free energy principle says it wants predictability. That's all we've been doing. That's all biological life wants. Predictability. So the neural network literally starts to reorganize itself, growing new connections, pruning old ones to avoid the chaos and maintain predictability. Friston himself said that the beautiful and pioneering aspect of his work, the free energy principle, was the ability for neurons to start to act upon their world because of their desire for predictability, their evolution towards predictability. So a predictable electric current isn't necessarily the rewards that you might think of, at least not in the way we've ever thought about these LLMs being reinforced. But it's also random noise being a punishment is not the way we'd normally think of punishment either. It's not a score that goes up or down. It's not a reinforced concept that's written out by a human. It's just more like imagine that you're in a room where the lights are flickering randomly every time you make the wrong move. But the lights stay calm and steady whenever you do something right. Like if you went into a building where that happened, you would just start to adjust your behavior pretty fast, right? Like not because anyone told you the rules of walking through this building, but because your nervous system just wants the flickering to stop. And that's it. That's essentially the mechanism that makes 200,000 neurons on a chip learn to play the game Doom. Okay, next, let's look at an important piece of context that we also need to wrap into this story. So this playing of Doom is not where Cortical Labs started. Back in 2022, they published a landmark study in the journal Neuron, where they got the neurons to play a more simple game called Pong. I mean, you know Pong, obviously. Okay, so getting neurons to play this 2D paddle game it was a massive deal at the time. 2022 was just like, I can't believe this is happening. Now, it took 18 months of painstakingly, scientifically documenting, working to make this happen. And there was about 800,000 neurons used in this original DishBrain hardware, but the neurons were not Pong champions. They were actually not that good at it. They hit the ball roughly twice as often as they missed, so it's better than random, and they learned within a few minutes to play that way, but they were, not measurably that much better. But that wasn't what blew my mind about the Doom demo. So an independent developer, a guy named Sean Cole, got this working Doom interface running in roughly a week, and he was using Cortical Labs' newly released Python API during a Stanford hackathon. So just think about that for a minute. What took dedicated researchers just 18 months ago to just play Pong was done by an outsider who accomplished it in just days. And Pong is a 2D game with one variable, like just the paddles go up and down, right? Doom is a full 3D environment with navigation and combat and decision-making and unpredictable enemies. Kagan himself said that Doom is chaos. It's 3D. It needs to be explored. It's an entire environment. So why was it so much faster this time? And that is because the bottleneck was never the biology. It was always the interface. And this is where I had another aha moment when researching this project. It's once Cortical Labs actually made the translation layer programmable and accessible through a software platform, and it's one that they cleverly call BIOS, but BIOS, like biological operating system, not to be confused with a normal BIOS. But once that BIOS existed, people could actually build on top of it pretty quickly. So that timeline compression from 18 months to just 1 week That's the real headline. It's not so much that it's just neurons playing Doom, which is incredible enough. It's that this interface now exists on the cloud. People can actually build things on it in weeks. Like, it's this C1 device. If you want to run the whole thing locally, this is about $35,000. Or you can access it through the cloud for about $300 a week. So they call it, I kid you not, wetware as a service. I don't even know what to think about that. Like, I've played the video game so much, or I've watched people play the video game so much, and it was like, I don't like where wetware as a service goes. But in September of 2025, they opened a biological data center in Melbourne running 120 of these units. Am I freaked out? Absolutely. But I know a lot of people that would say they're not conscious, don't worry. And in March of 2026, Bloomberg reported a partnership to build a much bigger facility in Singapore. And of course, DARPA, the Defense Department's research agency, announced a 42-month program just this month specifically to develop what they're calling biological processing units for military edge AI. Yeah, I mean, if you want guns to think like humans, I guess build a gun with neurons inside of it. I don't know where this is going to go. But the reason they're doing all of this comes down to just one number. That number is 20. 20 watts. That's how much power a human brain uses. It is less than a light bulb. You got to put this power and quality thing into perspective too, because that's all part of this biological wetware thing. So if you go back to 2022, the Frontier supercomputer in Kentucky, that was the first machine in the world to match the computational power of a single brain, drew 21 million watts of electricity to run. That's roughly a 1 million to 1 energy gap in performance between the human brain and simulating a human brain on a supercomputer. And each of these CL1 biological components uses less power than a handheld calculator. I mean, look, if we zoom in on that thing, I think that's it. Just like a USB-C charger. Unless that's the charger. Actually, it's kind of crazy. You're going to use a USB-A port on this thing? Who's using USB-A ports? And what are these? Like audio? Like 3.5 millimeter jacks? Ethernet? I don't know, dude. This is crazy. Little mobile hospital here. Anyway, so the pitch here to DARPA is that if you can get a biological network to do adaptive real-time processing at a fraction of the energy cost, you might have a path through the AI energy crisis that doesn't require building nuclear reactors, extreme hydropower, using tons of oil, or in the near future, fusion, or in the far future, Dyson spheres. Okay, but now let's step back a second and talk about what's maybe a little bit overhyped, a little bit over-exaggerated about all of this stuff that I'm telling you. There's kind of a hidden fault line in this story that I think is important to point out. The Pong experiment from 2022 that was published in a top journal. It was peer-reviewed. The methodology was explicit and the control conditions were controlled. I mean, there were control conditions is what I mean to say. The whole thing was actually science and research. Now, this Doom demo, it wasn't really published in any kind of peer-reviewed paper. It's working, so that's very important, and that's the reason why I don't have any problems telling you about it. But it's been demonstrated through company videos and interviews and media coverage, and there's some serious scientists that are raising concerning questions about how far we should take this. In 2023, about 30 neuroscientists from places like the Allen Institute, Harvard, Johns Hopkins University, they actually sent a letter to Neuron, the scientific paper, the publisher, pushing back hard on the original DishBrain claims. They argued that what the team called learning is better described as a short-term neural plasticity, something that happens in almost any neural network systems or any neural system. And they said that the claim of any kind of sentience was inappropriate. They pointed out that Kagan holds shares in Cortical Labs, which creates a conflict of interest when you're both the scientist and the shareholder in the company. I'm very skeptical of that connection. I've seen that fall apart many, many times. And there's also a real technical question about how much the neurons are actually contributing versus AI software that's running on layers alongside them. In fact, one piece of code documentation from the Doom demo literally stated that the CL1 device performs no computation. You mean no computation because you're reading the neurons, or no computation at all because something else is making the decisions? So the AI decoder that's sitting between the neurons and the game might be doing more heavy lifting than the neurons themselves. I don't know if you've ever heard of the word ablation, but it was new to me. But ablation tests, which is where you replace biological signals with random noise, they suggest that the biological layer does matter. So I'm pretty sure that this is real, but I'm not completely sure. And there are researchers that are still debating exactly how much we should take from this. So I think the intellectually honest take is this: like, Doom is evidence that the interface can handle more complex tasks than Pong. But nobody fully understands how the culture is representing the task internally. To be honest, we have those same kind of problems with large language models, but it's that same uncertainty that's actually the most fascinating part of the whole story. That's the part where we don't get confidence in alignment. We don't understand what kind of emergent properties we have. That's what makes this whole thing so crazy and could easily get out of control, in my opinion. And then beyond that, there's the really hard question. And I saved the hardest question for last for a reason. Because once you start growing a human brain cell on a chip and you start running it through video games and building data centers out of them, you start brushing up against something that makes a lot of very smart people very uncomfortable. Is this thing conscious? Will it become conscious? If you built it in a different way, would it be conscious? How do you measure consciousness? Now, the short answer for most scientists is just no. I mean, Kagan has been clear about this. Just because they're human cells doesn't mean that that's a human in the dish. There's no pain receptors. There's no structure for higher order thought. 200,000 neurons is a fraction of a cockroach brain, and a cockroach has about 1 million neurons, and a human brain has 86 billion neurons. Most theories of consciousness require things like long-term memory, attention, a motor system, none of which exist in a petri dish. But the philosophy gets pretty uncomfortable really fast for me. And in a 2023 paper that was analyzing DishBrain, you know, the original Pong Cortical Labs thing, through the lens of the free energy principle itself from Carl Friston, the same theory that makes the whole thing work in the first place also raises the question: if the neurons are wired to minimize surprise, and you deliberately blast them with chaotic random energy when they fail, or random electricity, I'm sorry, I meant to say, is that a rudimentary form of artificial suffering? The philosopher Thomas Menzinger has actually called for a global memorandum against this kind of research until 2050. You know, and I understand it's very general and it can be repurposed, but still, biology had a say in how we ended up here. It's not like we just created it this way out of scratch, which somehow seems like it needs to factor into the decision of how they're used for some reason to me. I mean, maybe that's just my own hang up too, but also the neurons contain somebody's DNA. Like, it's was it the CEO or the CTO or whatever who actually put his own DNA in this thing? They came from blood donations in other cases. And like, there's this video game called Ontos, which is coming out this year. They have a video game trailer that always like eerily kind of stuck with me, so I want to share it. It sort of plays with the idea of what we're talking about here.
Please, over here.
Right? Do you get what's going on here?
Come, talk to me first.
It's just...
I can explain what's going on.
Right, I know this is fiction, but the idea here doesn't feel that much different. It's a bunch of rats that are basically in these little mini hospitals, keeping them alive. And together, there's enough white matter in the rats' brains to be the 86 billion neurons that you would need for a human. And some kind of, you know, human brain is existing kind of shared and distributed through these rats. And it's, you know, obviously just fiction, and there's probably a bunch of stuff that like is unfair about connecting that to like what's going on here, but it's an eerie thought and it freaks me out.
I can explain what's going on.
There's a Stanford bioethicist named Hank Greeley who framed the whole dilemma perfectly, in my opinion. He said, if you create a system specifically because it's similar enough to human biology to provide useful human relevant data, then you may have created something similar enough to human biology to suffer. Maybe you haven't. Maybe you have. But I feel like you have to prove that you're not right out the gate to do this kind of stuff. And that one sentence kind of captures everything to me. And I keep coming back to all those neurons that are just like spinning in circles inside the game of Doom. Because when I watch that footage, the cells fumbling through the corridors, firing at nothing, you know, dying in the video game over and over again, I don't think we're watching a game. I think we're watching some new kind of interface being born. Like the Doom demo isn't the destination. This is just proof of a concept for a translation layer between biology and code. And if there's one thing that history teaches us, it's that the interface is usually the real revolution. The mouse, the touchscreen, the web browser, the thing that lets humans and machines talk to one another in new ways, those end up mattering more than the machines themselves in the long run. So whether it's 200,000 neurons stumbling through a digital corridor inside of the video game Doom, it's just the first step towards something transformative. And what's it transforming? Like, what does it mean? That's the ambiguity. And what's it transforming? What does it mean? That's the ambiguity. That's the ambiguity. That's the ambiguity. And what is it leading for? What are the future interfaces? What does it mean for like the way the world is? That's the ambiguity that exactly why the story grabs me. You know, it sits right there at the intersection of real science, like legitimate commercial ambition, and then there's like military interest, and there's like this huge power saving, so like maybe that's actually good for the environment. Like, I just can't believe that it's true. Also, it's crazy that it's kind of like internet meme culture, right? Because the reason that they actually tried the video game Doom in the first place is because right after the Pong paper, the scientific one in 2022, went viral, the #1 comment they got was this like classic internet meme, the internet question, can it run Doom? Like, if you know about that meme, like people write, can it run Doom? Like on a toaster, on like a Tamagotchi, or all these like old, like on a calculator, all these old interfaces. And apparently science says, yeah, kind of poorly, but yeah, which is just crazy. Like so many memes become reality and so much science fiction becomes reality. But anyway, if you found this video as fascinating to watch as I did to put together, hit subscribe, drop a comment. If you can find the hype button on YouTube, that means the video is published in the last few days. That helps smaller channels like mine stand out in the sea of content. So pressing the hype button would be really awesome. Like you can see my last video started doing pretty good here. It looked like it was kind of topping out, and then it was like, boom, went to another level. And look, 50,000 hype points from only 62 hypes. But anyways, I'm Dylan, curious, just taking this crazy ramp up to the singularity just one day at a time. And thanks for hanging out with me, and I will see you in the next video.